Okay, welcome back. Today I'm going to be showing you how to build a Sega Neptune. It's a 32X combined with the Sega Genesis Model 2. Now I followed these instructions from the Longhorn engineer. I'll link in the description a link to his blog or his website. So right now I'm just testing to make sure everything works properly, and as you can see everything is working. So I'm going to start the disassembly process. So I'll start with the 32X. Now most of this disassembly is just removing screws, so I don't have to go into too much detail. Now this bottom connector part gave me a little trouble, but I found out that you had to push it through and then everything else falls apart, so I'll just set all this stuff aside. Next I'm going to be removing these two ribbons because these two ferrite rings aren't necessary and they occupy space, so I'll just get rid of them. Now to remove these rings, I just pulled at them. Now these are glued in place with some sort of adhesive, but eventually they did come loose. So after I remove those rings, I'm just going to put the ribbons back in their place. So now I'm going to disassemble the Sega Genesis. I make sure to remove every single screw. I just want the board, I don't want anything else. So I'll set everything else aside for now. So now I'm going to take my desoldering gun and remove this cartridge connector since I won't be needing it anymore. Here's a closer shot of me removing the other side of the connector pins. So now I gotta remove these two rivets. This was actually quite the challenge because I scratched up the board a bit. Now be careful when you do this, you don't want to destroy a trace or anything. Here is where I slipped with the screwdriver and scratched those traces there, but I didn't remove any of the solder resist, so it was just a surface scratch. But you still want to keep that in mind and be careful when you do this. So here the connector is just being held by one rivet, so I just pried it up and it came off, but the rivet still stayed behind. So then I took a pair of pliers and just removed it. So next I'm going to remove this 7805 voltage regulator. Now in this case it's attached to a giant heatsink, so I'll have to use a piece of desoldering braid and remove everything. This heatsink was being stubborn, so I just reflowed it with some new solder and tried again. Eventually everything was loose enough, so I just wiggled it out. So now I gotta remove this large cap here. Now I didn't center my camera properly, so I didn't get a good shot of this. So here it is removed. So now I'm gonna take this ribbon wire here and just pre-tin it, because I'm gonna attach it to the large cap. So now I'll push the ribbon through the hole. Now the yellow end of the wire is the positive lead, so I'll make sure to put the yellow end on the positive lead of the capacitor. Now these joints aren't the greatest in the world, but they should hold. Now I'll wrap some electrical tape around each leg so they don't touch anything else. So next I'll do the same thing for the voltage regulator. Now I use thicker gauge wire. I think this is 20 AUG wire. You don't, because it's a voltage regulator, so you don't want thin wire. Now in this case it's 3, and you want to make sure that you put each wire in its correct orientation, because you don't want to crisscross these wires. So then I'll just follow it up with some alcohol just to clean up these joints a bit. So when you're done, it should look something like this. So now I gotta remove this AV out. Now I turn the board over and I'll just desolder all these pins. So these corner ground pins, I couldn't get to them with my desoldering gun, so I just used a piece of desoldering braid to remove them. So eventually everything got loose and I just wiggled it out. Now back over to the 32X, you want to do the same thing for this AV connector. Now the one you're removing is the one furthest from the power port. So next I need to reuse this AV connector from the 32X. So I took an X-Acto knife and I just pried off the metal housing. So next I fluxed and pre-tinned a piece of 6-inch ribbon wire. Now there was too much slack in this ribbon. I should have used maybe 4 or 4.5 inches instead. So here I just fed the first 5 bottom holes first. Then I trimmed the excess wire with some wire cutters. So now I take a separate ribbon and I do the same thing for the next 5 holes. So now for the most annoying part of this project, soldering to these little pins on this connector here. I'm not good at soldering things like this, so if you do take on this project, I wish the best of luck to you. Next, on the main board, I want to lower the profile of these caps. So what I do is I heat the bottom of the pins and I just lean them over. As you can see here, it's not the greatest shot, but I'm heating the pins from the bottom end of the board and then lifting them a bit and bending them over. I do this for most of the capacitors on the middle of the board. The ones around the edges don't obstruct the 32X, so I leave them alone. I also go over the capacitors I lean over just to give them better joints. As you can see, most of the capacitors that I bent over, they're in the middle of the board. The ones next to the power switch, the large majority of them, I left them alone. So then back over to the 32X, I'm gonna add solder to these pins just to prep them. So I got these 24 AUG Arduino jumper wires off of Amazon. Now these are perfect because I tried previously doing this project with 28 AUG ribbon cable, and I wasn't successful. Some games wouldn't load, so I was successful with these wires. So right here, I glued them all with a piece of tape. I lined them down and they sit perfectly and they space perfectly with the pins on the cartridge connector. So I insert them to the port and then I bend them over and just lean them forward towards the front of the board. So the shorter these data lines, the better. In this case, this set of data lines I'm cutting to about 3.5 inches, and the other ones, the ones that come out over the 32X board, not the ones that go to the bottom of the 32X board, if that makes any sense. These are the shorter set of wires and they're cut about 3.5 inches. The other ones I cut by ear, so as I went along, and I unfortunately didn't get a video of that, but I'll explain it later in this video. So here you can see that I'm connecting them one by one, and this is the 3.5 inch lines, and they're going straight from the cartridge connector to the board. This is the bottom of the 32X board. When it lays flat over your Genesis, this would be the side that goes towards the bottom. So here's one side of the board finished, and now I'm going to do another set of wires like this. So here it is. I just taped the lines together and I made another connector. Now I bent it at a 90-degree angle, so one set of wires will go on top and the other set of wires will go on bottom, and then they both bent forward towards each other, towards the same side of the board. And then now I'm just soldering those two boards in place. So you can imagine on the other side of this board, just two sets of taped up jumper wires, two sets of 32 pins together, and they're both bent towards the same side. In this case, it's toward the left side of the screen on the other side of the board. So here I feel the need to say that this is my second attempt on this same unit, so going forward from this part of the video you might see some continuity errors, because I tried previously doing this project with standard ribbon cable and I'd got a lot of crosstalk. Some games wouldn't load, some games would give errors, other games would work. So going forward I'm going to try to explain myself. But I must say that those Arduino wires really were successful, so I'll link in the description where I got them. So next I pried off this metal shielding around the 32X connector. Now here's where the continuity errors start. On the bottom of the board you see the rainbow ribbon. That's no longer there, so that's number one, just to keep in mind. So right here you're looking at the bottom end of the Genesis board. This is where the AV port was sitting. Now the AV port is long gone, but I want to add a little solder because I still need these pads. This just replaces the need to have to use that 32X special cable, that one that comes up from the Genesis to the input of the 32X. So I'm just direct connecting them now. So once again I must say that these pads are really annoying to solder to. I'm not good at this. These pads aren't meant to be soldered this way. They're through holes, not surface mount like this. So please forgive those terrible joints. Also, the bottom right pin is broken, the trace is lifted, so I follow the trace and find the first spot that I can anchor it, and then I'll just pin it there. So skipping forward, I did finish the rest of the AV section off camera, and I also added this thicker 20 AUG wire for the power source. So now I only need one power supply. So here's another continuity error. See those ribbons? That's not the final product, but I felt the need to explain myself because I did swap the LED. So here I'm just taking out the original LED and adding an orange one, just to keep the theme of the 32X. I think the orange and yellow fits it better. So I have to replace this little metal brace so I can pin this port down, because I can't hot glue it down or it will fall off right away. So my father fashioned together this little piece of metal that will house the AV cord, and I can actually fit it perfectly and then solder it to the bottom of the board, and it will never move from there. So here you'll notice that the black wire isn't soldered to the board, because that's the 5-volt line that comes from the Genesis that goes to the 32X. Now the 32X has its own power supply, so it shouldn't have 5 volts at the AV port like that. So if you notice on the 32X proprietary cable, one pin is left off, and that's the 5-volt line. So I desoldered it just to protect the unit. So now now that the brace is in place, I can just fit the connector upside down. Now keep in mind, you're now going to have to put in your Genesis cables upside down. So to prevent crosstalk between the wires, I just taped up 3.5 inch by 3.5 inch pieces of aluminum. Now make sure to wrap tape around this so they won't short against anything. So here's the finished product with all the tin foil under everything, and as you can see, the wires, the orientation of the wires are much neater and nicer than what you saw earlier. Now what I did was I stripped the wires one by one, and then I tinned them and soldered them in place. Now the reason why I did it all off camera is because I didn't know if this was going to be successful or not, and I didn't really want to waste any time. So because I had previously did the work and it didn't come out great. So as you can see, I was successful. The game fired up. Now the static and hum you hear is from the cheap SCART cables. Now I bought these SCART cables off Console 5. Now I want to say Console 5 is one of the greatest websites for any console repair enthusiast, but their SCART cables are below average. These SCART cables still get the job done, but if you're an enthusiast of Sega Genesis and you play almost every day, yeah, you want to be on the lookout for better cables. Now for the bottom half of this board, I'm going to take off this shield, and I'm just going to cut it in places that I need to cut, just so these wires can pass through without having any obstruction. So I'm just cutting little pieces off the edges here. So then I'll take a pair of pliers and just straighten out some of the edges here. So now for the top shell plastic, I'm going to get rid of this card connector. And for the 32X top shell, I'm going to need this card connector because this is a little bit longer. So this is the one I'm going to be using. So now I'm going to reassemble everything once again. This is the old assembly video, but the newer one was basically the same, so I didn't record it. But this is how I assembled everything on camera. Also, when I said those wires were 6 inches or so, they could have been about an inch or two shorter, because right here there's a lot of slack, but I didn't feel the need to resolder everything or recut everything, so I just made sure the wires weren't crimped or pinching up against anything, and I just laid them like they are. So earlier when I cut the shield, it was just so this heat sink can sit nicely right in this corner here. Now I got these little rubber gaskets, I guess they are, and I'm just gonna sit them between the 32X and the Genesis cartridge board, just so they can absorb the weight of inserting cartridges and taking cartridges out. And then I just got these wooden skewers just to hold the board in place as I screw everything together. Now the Genesis has 400 screws, so I do most of this off camera. So for the 2 screws for the cartridge connector, I got number 5 1-inch wood screws, and they work well. So this is the ones I use now. The one on the right's already in, and this is the one on the left. So here I take a Dremel tool, and I'm going to carve a 45-degree angle on both sides of this cartridge connector, because now that the board is a little bit taller, the dust flaps are now obstructed by this connector. Now when you're working with a Dremel tool against circuitry like this, it's important that you go as fast as possible. You wear a blindfold and you don't take your time. You just do it as fast as you can, look away, do other things, answer your phone, text message, do it while driving. That's the way to go. So then I was left with a lot of plastic shavings all over the board, so I just got this duster, keyboard cleaner, and I just sprayed it to clear off the dust. So here you can see the 32X games are a bit longer. They're the same width, but you're gonna have to file down the cartridge port just to widen it a bit. Now I did most of this filing off camera. You really want to fine tune this just to make it look nice, and I didn't really want to bore you with too much filing. So here's the finished product. As you can see, everything fits. So here's the 32X dust cover bracket. Now it's a little bit long or a little bit tall, so you want to cut it along this edge here just to shorten it a bit. So here's after I shortened it and sanded it down a bit, and it's right there short. Now these little ends here, I actually drilled them just because I need to adjust the cartridge port a bit, and the 32X and the Sega Genesis, they're not really compatible, so that's why you're seeing that there. So on these dust flaps here, I did file away this excess edge, and I used the Dremel tool just to go faster. Now be careful when you're dremeling these down, because you can mess it up. So now after I'm done filing the cartridge flaps down, I'll attach them back to the mounting bracket. Since this mounting bracket has been altered now, I use a washer on all 3 screws just to hold it in place a little bit better. Now the reason why the flaps on the right side, they look like they're bent at an angle, I did bend them at an angle. I used a hot air rework station just to warm up the plastic, and then I just pulled them apart slightly. So here's the door flap after I'm done, and it works well. I wish someone would 3D print the whole mounting bracket along with the door slots that actually fit perfectly on the Genesis. That would be great, but maybe one day. So here's me just finishing it up. I'm adding the top cover to the bottom. Now I'm actually looking from a different angle than the camera is, and I'm looking on the bottom across landscape to see if anything's being pinched or obstructed. You don't want to have the reset button obstructed. You don't want the LED light or even the power switch to be obstructed, so keep that in mind when you're closing everything, but it should still close more or less nicely. So after everything is closed up, it works really well. The cartridges fit, the dust flaps aren't obstructed. So let's test this thing. So as you can see, the unit on the left is actually my first unit I made a couple of months ago, and that one actually works well. I don't know why I used 28 AUG ribbon wire and that worked, but when I tried it the second time it was giving me issues. So now I think I'm gonna, if I ever make another one of these units, I'm gonna go with the instructions on this video and go with the Arduino wires. But as you can see, everything is working well. I'm gonna fast forward through some of these segments here just to minimize background noise and just to get to the gameplay a little faster. Street Fighter 2 for Genesis was giving me trouble before, but now it loads up and it works well. And because somebody will ask, yes, it does work with the Sega CD attachment, and here it is right now. Now in closing, I just wanted to say that I really did enjoy making this video, and it was frustrating at times, and I know I didn't have all the footage that I should have had. I do apologize for that. Bear with me, I'm still getting used to recording, video editing, and commentating. With that said, I hope you still enjoyed this video, and if you want, you can share with your friends. I hope you like, comment, and subscribe, and once again, thank you for watching.